last episode, you mentioned a phrase that I am absolutely fascinated with. And you talk about it a lot in your podcast, which is wonderful. I'm going to mess it up. Osteosarcopenic obesity. Did I do it right?
Absolutely.
Wow.
You
Okay.
did
I've
it
been
right.
practicing. I've been
Yeah.
practicing. Great. Okay. I think when we think about our bodies, especially those things, we think about, bones. What do bones do? They hold us up. That's pretty much all they do. What do muscles do? Muscles move your arm a little bit and help you walk or run or whatever you want to do. And fat is universally hated by everybody. It just sits there and nobody likes it. Everybody wants it to go to zero and be gone. And that's kind of how we think about these things. And I don't think we think about the link between all of them. And I don't think we know where how complicated some of these things are. So I don't know if there's a place you want to start with that, but I'm just going to put that out there as far as that term. And I would like to know how you think about that.
So yeah, with osteosarcopenic obesity, so the osteo is the bone, sarcopenia, we're talking about, muscle, actually loss of muscle, and then obesity, which is a fat mass and fat dysfunction issue, right? So even the term obesity has been oversimplified and misunderstood. So mostly we think of obesity as a weight issue. If we are a slightly more sophisticated, then we'll think about it as a fat mass issue, too much fat, right? But it's actually that plus dysfunctional fat, okay? So we have to look at the function and then also the quantity or the amount of fat that we have to actually define obesity, but that's rarely done. So right now we just look at the number on the scale, and that doesn't even look at how much fat you're made of, okay? And the reason that we're not successful in countering obesity is because, like I said, we don't even understand the problem. We think of it as a number on the scale. Now, if we're dealing with fat mass and fat dysfunction, the main thing to recall is that in a sense, because what you just said is true. A lot of people come to me and they say, get rid of all the fat, Dr. Loh, help me get rid of this fat, right? The thing is, some of this fat is protective. It's a buffer, and it was made that way for us to have metabolic flexibility so we can store in times that we need, right? That we have plenty, and for times where we might not have enough nutrients. Okay, but we want to store it in such a way it's accessible, but we don't want the fatty acids floating around in our bloodstream because they can be very toxic. And then then the fatty acids can become different lipid species like ceramides and so forth. And those are very, very toxic. Okay, so one way to do that is just to sequester it in fat tissue that was made to store these lipid droplets, right? The oils. Okay, but then there are places in your body which was never made to do that. But when you run out of storage room in the real fat tissue, then we're just going to stuff it somewhere else. And that ends up being in organs, in the viscera and so forth. So when we say visceral fat, we're actually talking about one component of ectopic fat, ectopic meaning out of place. So fat where it shouldn't be, right? And you shouldn't have fat really in your liver. You shouldn't have fat in your pancreas or in your kidneys, right? So you have fat around the kidneys, but you don't have fat in the kidneys, for example. So ectopic fat and visceral fat is, one type of ectopic fat. But it's a great proxy because if someone has a lot of visceral fat, then you can imagine that they probably have fat that's out of place in other regions, in the liver, in the lungs, for example. People don't think of fat in the lungs, but asthma, COPD, right? A lot of it is reacting to the toxic substances that the fat in the lungs are actually putting out. Okay? Nobody thinks of fatty lungs, fatty liver, but no fatty lungs, right? That was actually confirmed in 2019, and they actually saw, ectopic fat in the lungs.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, which is why, again, if someone has asthma or COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, really, the indication is to get rid of that fat. That's causing a lot of the irritation, right? Someone has atrial fibrillation, that's fat in the heart, right? And that fat is irritating the heart. It's interrupting conduction pathways in the heart and so forth. Okay, so then the primary indication is you have to get rid of that kind of fat. All right, so we have different compartments of fat, and generally we were made with fat tissue to help buffer, these fatty acids and have a storage place for us. But when you run out of space, then you get into trouble because now you start indiscriminately storing it in other places, right? So when you see a patient, you have to assess, where is this patient? Yes, the patient may have obesity, okay, but that's, by just fat mass. But that's not as bad. This is not, so it's on the spectrum. It's not as sick as the person who has increased fat mass and now spillage into the ectopic compartments. Okay. Now, so if you just have increased fat mass, that's what is generally known as metabolically healthy obese. So people say, oh, you can be big and still healthy, right? So that would be metabolically healthy obese because we are storing the fat in the appropriate place. The bad news is most people who are metabolically healthy obese will convert to metabolically unhealthy obese within 7 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, most people will convert within 7 years and everyone will convert within 10 years.
Wow.
That's what the data says. Okay, so an example is I have a patient, she came to me and she was over 40 something percent, quite high, 48% or something, body fat, but she had it all in the subcutaneous, right? Like a lot of women, it's in the gluteal areas, the hips, the thighs. Okay, and she had very low visceral fat. But she came back 3 years later, she was a little higher in percent body fat, and now she had accumulated all of that fat inside the abdominal cavity. What a change. Okay, weight was, maybe she gained 20 pounds over the last time I saw her, but body composition and where the fat was had changed. So, metabolically now, she's not the same as she was 3 years ago. And you have to recognize that she's in a worse situation now. So what she did was she converted from metabolically healthy obese to metabolically unhealthy obese within 3 years. That's generally what I see. It's very common. Okay.
Wow.
Then number one, now the first thing when I see that, I always look at the muscle mass. Okay, and you will almost always see a corresponding decrease in muscle. Okay, sometimes the muscle will stay the same. That's can be very deceptive, right? When you adjust, by the time you adjust for the BMI and all that, you actually find that they actually have less muscle mass. And even if they keep the same muscle mass, they have poorer quality muscle. So when you define sarcopenia, again, like fat, you have to look at mass, so the amount of muscle tissue you have, and we're talking skeletal muscle, not smooth muscle here. But okay, we look at the amount of muscle, then you have to look at quality. So when sarcopenia is strength, which looks at quality, right? Strength and performance, and then muscle mass. So there are two components. So again, we have to make sure we dial in. It's not just how much you have, what's the quality of that muscle.
Yeah, that's
okay?
such a good point.
Yeah. And then, people who have poor muscle mass, they're going to have poor bone. All right, bone, same thing. Bone mineral density is what we're used to looking at. All right. And then the thinking is the more dense your bones, then the stronger they are. That's the general thinking, right? Except that Asian women, for example, have lower mineral density, right? But they rarely have fractures, not compared to like Caucasian women. They have stronger bone because the microarchitecture of the bone is different. Right. So the quality of the bone is different. The structure is different. So again, we're looking at the amount of minerals, but we also have to look at the quality. So in all aspects of metabolically healthy, of metabolic tissue, whether it's fat or muscle or bone, you have to look at mass components, which, okay, if we do think that way, we generally just look at the mass, but you have to look at the quality of the tissue as well.
Wow. So
Right.
when you get one of those things, do you get all of those things? Like if I
Yes.
start gaining a lot of fat, I notice that I at some point will be losing muscle, and also my bone quality and density, both of those things, like you explained, is also getting more poor. All of those things come
Yes,
together.
because it's a fat muscle bone axis, right? And your body composition, you impact one part, you gain more fat, and yes, you gain some weight, but a lot of times you're going to shift the axis and you're going to have less muscle bone and poorer quality muscle bone. Okay.
Mm.
And then this perpetuates the cycle because a lot of the sick fat is highly inflammatory to muscle and to bone. So type 2 diabetics, for example, have, this is very well known, accelerated muscle loss. Okay, which is a terrible situation because we talked about this a little bit last week. Think about this. They already have type 2 diabetes. So they're struggling with high blood sugar, right? And they're in a situation of accelerated muscle loss. What did we say about muscle last week? If you shrink the muscle compartment, right? Now, where is the sugar going to go? So we get that person, maybe even cutting some of their carbs, okay? But they still have this toxic fat, visceral fat. And a lot of people will lose weight, but they still will have a huge amount of visceral fat. This is very, very common in my population of patients. That's why, I never say you're done until I look to see where the fat is and I know what kind of fat it is, right? So someone will lose, let's say 60 pounds and their doctor is really happy. I'm like, no, you still have huge, all your fat is in the visceral compartment, and that is decimating your muscle, for example, causing fibrosis in liver and so forth. So, we're not done. Okay, so now here we are. You may have lost weight, so you lost some muscle as well in that weight loss process. But here's the thing, now you may be eating better, quote unquote, but there's a smaller reservoir to contain the glucose. So there's more spillage. So we set up this accelerated cycle, right? So this is why it's really important to preserve muscle mass, especially in people who already have metabolic disease.